So today we're going to be talking about consent. The first type of consent that I want to mention to you is active consent. So in active consent, the person either says something or writes something down to indicate that they have consented. They engage in an action. So that can be either verbal or written, but the idea is that they engage in some sort of action that allows you to know that consent has been given. Now, this is considered an improvement over tacit consent. Okay. The word tacit means quiet. Tacit consent is basically you didn't say no, therefore you consent to what's going on. The problem with tacit consent is that someone may be unable to say no. For example, if someone is incapacitated due to drugs or alcohol. Or it might be the case that the consent situation has been set up in such a way that there's a cost to saying no. So if I were to say, for example, I would like to start class 10 minutes late next time, and if you disagree with me, you must cut off your middle finger in order to show that disagreement. You may not want class to start 10 minutes late, but you really want to keep your finger, so you're not going to pay the cost of dissenting, okay? Now, traditionally, there have been a bunch of anti-rape laws that went into effect that basically centered around the idea of no means no. In other words, if either partner at any time says no, then business has to stop because they're no longer consenting, right? And I'm sure a lot of you have heard this idea of no means no. The problem, though, is that sometimes people think that if no means no, well, if you didn't say no, therefore you consented, okay? So tacit consent is a type of consent, but it is not as strong a type of consent as active consent. So as an example, ACC says that when you receive your syllabus for a class, if you remain enrolled in the course, you have consented to the course policy. That would be tacit consent. You could have withdrawn from the class, but you did not. Therefore, you didn't dissent to the course policy, and hence you consented to the course policy. So we might think of this as the, well, you didn't say no, therefore you said yes type of consent. But can we all see why this is a weaker form of consent than active? Okay, good. The next type of consent is called hypothetical. In this type of consent, no one asked you for your consent, but if they had asked you, you would have almost certainly said yes. When we get to Hobbes, this is the type of consent that Hobbes is going to argue that we give to government. But let's come up with an example that works for our own lives. Do you all remember when a few years ago, everybody was given an extra $600 on their tax return for, I think it was earned income credit? Okay, did anyone ask you, would you like an extra $600 on your tax return? But if they had, what would you have said?
Yeah.
Unless there are some in the audience who are concerned with questions of national debt, right? And then you might have said no. But for the most part, everybody's going to be like, yeah, I'll take an extra $600. So hypothetical consent basically says you weren't asked, but if you had been asked, you would have said yes. This also sometimes includes situations of consent where you're not capable of consenting, but if you were capable, you clearly would have consented. So for example, let's say that I were to have a seizure right this second and be on the floor, unable to breathe, and I'm bleeding, right? And I'm passed out. can I consent in that moment to medical treatment? No, I'm incapacitated, so I can't consent. But if I could be asked, would I say yes? Yes, most likely. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, there might be religious objections to getting medical intervention, but the idea is most people reasonably would expect that if you were asked in that situation that you would say yes. So we're going to call that hypothetical consent. All right. The fourth type of consent that I want to talk to you about is retroactive. I haven't seen this much in the literature, but it's something that I like to include in lecture. Retroactive means that it's happening going backwards, right? So effectively, retroactive consent is when you consent today to something that happened in the past, okay? My favorite example of this, you're in the shower, you notice that you're out of shampoo, your roommate has a full bottle of shampoo, you use your roommate's shampoo, and then when you see them over breakfast, you say, hi, I hope you don't mind that I used your shampoo. Right? Hopefully the roommate says, yes, that's fine, but none of us are going to run out of the shower to go ask the roommate, may I use your shampoo? Right? Before then going back into the shower and using it. So the roommate is agreeing at 9 o'clock in the morning to an action that occurred at 8:15. That's retroactive consent. Okay. There are some issues with active consent. Right now, we've kind of talked about it as being the best type of consent, and it is for the ones that we've listed. But there's a type of consent that's even better than active consent, and that's enthusiastic consent. And one of the readings that I've asked you to read for next class is a blog, Dr. Nerdlove. It's definitely NC-17, but it talks about some of the differences between active consent and enthusiastic consent. Whereas in active consent, you say yes. In enthusiastic consent, you say yes and you really mean it and you really want to. So the reality of life is that often we agree to do things that we don't really want to or that we're not super comfortable with because there are other pressures on us. So you could imagine a situation where your boss asks you to have dinner. You have other plans for the night, but you say yes because you don't want to say no to your boss the week before your performance review. So that would be a situation where you've actively consented, right? You gave verbal agreement to go to dinner, but really in your heart of hearts, you don't want to. So enthusiastic consent is not present. Now in the sexual context, the reason why this comes up is that some states have gone away from a no means no law and to a yes means yes law, which basically requires that verbal or another express form of consent occur in order for consent to truly be there. And some critics have argued, well, okay, both partners may say yes, but that doesn't mean that we're absolutely certain that both partners are enthusiastic about the activity, right? One partner may be feeling pressured. So I guess this is kind of an NC-17 example too, but imagine that, you have a couple that's been in a relationship for a long time and it's her birthday. And he's not really in the mood, but she keeps saying, oh, come on, it's my birthday. Can't you just give me oral sex this one time, right? And she just keeps pressuring him. Now, he may agree to it, right? He may say, yes, okay, honey, I'll do this since it's your birthday. But does he really want to in the scenario that I've just described? Not really. So that would be a situation where maybe active consent has occurred, but enthusiastic consent has not occurred. And part of what I'm trying to get y'all to practice before spring break, where you're probably going to put these into practice regardless of whether or not I've lectured about it, is to be thinking in terms of how can we get to enthusiastic consent? How can we make sure that each partner is just as happy as the other one to be doing this? So part of the discussion is that we often think of sex as something that you take or give from someone, but part of what enthusiastic consent is trying to get us to do is to move to a more participatory model, where sex is something that we all do, or I guess some of us, not necessarily all of us at the same time, but then there's something to be said for, the partners are doing this thing together, and each is participating, and each is excited to be participating, and that each is participating and excited about participating equally, or at least close to it. That you don't have one partner that is being begrudging about it in some way. Any questions?